It looked, on paper, to be the perfect business marriage. The Indian telecom giant Bharti Airtel, the third largest telecom in the world, had been looking to expand in Africa. The Zain Group of Kuwait had been looking for a buyer for the company's assets in Africa, which covered 15 countries. When the two announced a deal, the media comments were less than kind. Too expensive, said one. Pained by Zain, said another, as public shares in Bharti plunged 14%. It was a high-debt deal, but it also gave the Indian telecom an opportunity to diversify revenues in the under-penetrated African market. As with every merger or acquisition, there were cultural factors that would influence how the two companies would integrate operations. For one, telecom regulators in each of the 15 countries would have to approve the takeover. The government of Congo Republic didn't like the deal, said it broke the local regulations. There was a dispute about minority ownership of Zain's operations in Nigeria, the biggest market in the deal. And some employees of Zain resented Indian ownership so much they went on strike. What became clear was that Bharti could not treat all 15 countries as homogeneous Africa. It wasn't as simple as India dialing up Africa. The deal did close eventually, albeit with a new company name for African operations, Airtel Africa. Today on Stories and Strategies, communication between cultures. It's been around for thousands of years, and if we're going to succeed as professional communicators, we'd better learn how to do it strategically. My name is Doug Downs. My guest today is Subhamoy.das. Hi, Subhamoy.
Hi, Doug. Great to be on your show.
And you're joining us today from New Delhi, India. How are things where you are? It's winter where you are, right?
Yes, it's almost peak winter, and I think, it's looking better from a COVID point of view. Things are finally looking bright. And that's if I have to give you an optimistic view. Because the third wave of COVID seems to be behind us here in India, and I hope we defeat this virus completely. So as of today, Doug, India has double vaccinated more than half its entire population, and almost 70% have had at least one dose, and that's roughly 950 million people. That's almost 3 times the population of the US that have got at least one dose of vaccination.
That's fantastic. Here in Canada, and of course in the United States, we have some, the vaccination rates have been, well, good is subjective, but of course there are some who are opposed to vaccination. Do you have some of that opinion?
Not at all, no. So that's a cultural difference, So we'll talk about that more in the show. How people of different cultures are of different individualistic, thoughts, and we'll discuss that. Where you respect hierarchy, where you respect, rules and regulations, and there are cultures who just wants to impose their own and not a believer of, anything that is imposed on.
Yeah. Well, it's refreshing to hear. Subhamoy, you are the president of IABC India, and you've presented, I know, a number of times at the IBC World Conference. You're scheduled to speak at the 2022 World Conference in New York that's coming up this summer. You lead marketing and communications at a global tech and professional services giant in India and have been in the industry now for 24 years, being part of having led global teams in multinational companies such as General Electric, Deloitte, PayPal, and Accenture. You have a postgraduate diploma in communications from the Indian Institute of Mass Communication in New Delhi, a master's in English literature from the University of North Bengal, and have continued to educate yourself further at the Indian Institute of Management in Calcutta, the Indian School of Business, Duke University, and the Swedish Institute in Stockholm, where you studied sustainable business management. Subhamoy, you wrote Chapter 14 of the new IABC Guide for Practical Business Communication, the chapter entitled Intercultural Communication in the Workplace. We live in an increasingly digital and therefore shrinking world. I mean, it shrunk. You and I live literally on opposite sides of the globe, and yet we can have a conversation at any time. We can text each other. We can talk by phone just using apps that are available. Well, WhatsApp is the big one that's available. And yet, this concept of intercultural communication, it's not new. In fact, cross-cultural communication is probably the foundation of communication when we were in tribes, right?
Yeah, Doug. Yeah, it's very old, older than we can imagine, because I mean the communication in between teams and between people, that of course predates this. But when people started to started to travel or to go beyond their cultures, so that's when the need for intercultural communication, as we understand today, began. So it's been there for thousands of years, because people had to learn about other cultures and adapt that when entering their new territories. So when we talk of territories, we talk about those rulers who went out to invade other lands and annex territories. So you've heard of Alexander the Great. That's an example. Genghis Khan here in Asia. They built enormous empires because they were able to do that because they appreciated and assimilated various aspects of different cultures as they expanded. And a bad example of that is Imperial Japan or Nazi Germany. They failed because they underestimated neighboring cultures and their allies.
So let's define what you and I mean by intercultural communication here in 2022. Clearly define the differences between national cultures and organizational cultures.
So the term intercultural communication was first used by the American anthropologist Edward Hall, and that this was in 1959. And his observation that people of different cultures they communicate and behave in different ways, and this led him to differentiate cultures on the basis of how communication is sent and received. So Hall's definition of intercultural communication is very simple. It is communication between persons of different cultures. That's it. So now, if you interpret this in the business context, so it's a more relevant definition that was on the basis of this with the authors Cheney and Martin. They defined intercultural communication in 2014. This is a much more recent definition, which is communication within and between businesses that involves people from more than one cultures. Very straightforward and very relevant to business. Um, and there are other related terms, Doug, that we get confused with when we talk of intercultural communication. There is something called cross-cultural communication that you have heard. So they are distinct from each other in the sense that while the former, which is intercultural communication, focuses on interaction between two cultures, the latter, which is cross-cultural communication, is more concerned with the comparisons between different cultures. So when you're comparing one culture with the other, cross-cultural communication, that's the prerogative of cross-cultural communication. And another related term that you may have heard in this context is the international communication. So, and that's completely different because we must remember that while international communication can only take place between people from different countries, intercultural communication may also occur within a single nation of different of multiple cultures, just like in India or maybe the United States or the entire Europe. But organizational or business culture is different because it's essentially a system of the shared values, the beliefs, the attitudes, the rituals and practices that govern how people behave in that particular organization. This may include the company's expectations, their experiences, ethos, and all of these that characterize the company, and in each company has got a unique personality, as you know.
There are models for understanding cultures and communication styles, and you listed several of them in your chapter. For example, Hofstede's cultural dimensions, the 7 culture clusters. Spend some time with me here and walk me through these models because this is the science.
Yes, we must get acquainted with these. I have, when I didn't delve into it, I didn't know about this, but as communicators, we must know because, as you said, there is a science behind it. Some of them are very complicated, but I'll go with the most relevant one for business communicators, which I mentioned in the book, is the Hofstede's cultural dimensions. Um, and this guy, Geert Hofstede, he over several years between 1967 and 1970s, he studied the results of the global surveys of IBM, the IBM Corporation, their values. And these global surveys were taken by employees in over 50 countries at that time, and it just it became more and more uh, countries and nationalities were included over time. And these determine the dimensions on which business cultures differ from country to country. And this has further evolved over years. So, according to Hofstede, there are 6 dimensions that distinguish one culture from another. And there are these, I just rattle off them, the names of these 6, and then tell you what they are. So, PDI, it's Power Distance Index, individualism versus collectivism, masculinity versus femininity. You have uncertainty avoidance index. These are all technical terms. UAI, that's the fourth. Number 5, long-term versus short-term orientation. Number 6 is indulgence versus restraint. So these are a little complicated, but I'll go one by one and delve into these. So PDI is the power distance index. This is actually the degree to which inequality and power are accepted in a culture. For example, a high PDI culture has very high respect for authority, and this encourages bureaucracy. Low PDI cultures encourage flat organizational structures and more participative management style. Number 2 is individualism versus collectivism. Basically, I versus we dimension. So while individualism emphasizes on attaining personal goals, collectivism places high importance on the goals of collective well-being, right? So that's I versus we. Number 3 is masculinity versus femininity, or just tough versus tender. This focuses on the culture's gender preferences and emphasis on equality, which has become very important now. Uh, I mean, you can look at the different characteristics of the masculinity features, such as assertiveness, or wealth building, and as contrasted against such feminine qualities as care, or modesty, or quality of life. That was 3. Number 4 is UAI, or Uncertainty Avoidance Index. This measures the degree to which uncertainty is allowed in a culture. A high UAI culture has low tolerance for ambiguity, and so greater, uh, 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 and that's why no risk taking at all. But a low UAI culture has high acceptance for the unknown, and so better risk taking. That was Uncertainty Avoidance Index. Number 5 is long-term versus short-term orientation dimension. So this focuses more, long-term focuses more on the future and long-term success, and lays more importance on patience and persistence, perseverance, all of those. And short-term orientation, those cultures focus on the near future, and they want quick results. That was number 5. Number 6, the last one of these 6 dimensions, is indulgence versus restraint, on how cultures can control its need to fulfill desires and impulses. Like indulgence, by that you mean for the maybe love for life or joy of living. These are contrasted against suppression of gratification of senses. And that can be achieved through stricter social norms, rules, and regulations. So that was indulgence versus restraint. And then this was later on simplified over the years. The Hofstede, it developed into a company, and then the Hofstede Insights Consultancy came in, and they later on developed 7 cultural cluster models, and they simplified this further into clusters, which is competition or competitor cultures. So the competitor cultures are like UK, US, Australia, New Zealand. They're very competitive, so that's competitor culture. Then you have the organizer culture. They follow orders diligently, like Germany. Then there are connected cultures like Dutch and Scandinavians, because they believe in openness and transparency than anything else. Then you have the diplomat culture, which is, these are the societies that greatly value social, individual freedom rather than social, while they also respect hierarchy. Examples are Belgium and France. Then you have the reciprocator culture, which is the people in the Middle East, the South Americans, Southeast Asians, even Africans, especially East and West Africa. These people mostly interact by exchanging favors. So they belong to this reciprocator culture. The sixth is marathonian cultures like Asian countries, mostly China. They are not fully transparent and often do not reveal their true objectives. And then the craftsman culture, they are very meticulous with details and everything that they do. You can imagine Japan. That's perhaps the best example of a craftsman culture.
Where would you place the North American culture in those 7 clusters? I heard your examples.
That's basically the competitor culture. I would say US, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, most of the English speaking countries. Uh, Looks like that's what characterizes the competitor culture. Number one.
Is that go for India as well?
No, I think India would go into kind of a reciprocator culture, because exchanging favors, and also maybe connected, like Scandinavians. A more simplified but generalized approach was suggested by Mind Hauser. And this can be really useful for business communicators, because this approach basically characterizes people into 4 basic groups: the action-oriented people, process-oriented people, task-oriented people, and role-oriented people. So I think this is much simpler to remember. Especially when you're communicating with people with different cultural orientations, you can remember these 4. So action-oriented people, they mostly belong to the Anglo-Saxon countries such as England, in the United States, and they are generally quick with decision making, and are driven to success and not afraid to fail. Then you have the process oriented people, mainly from Latin America, the Latin American cultures. They're more interested in the process than the results, according to Hausa. And the process oriented people are averse to conflicts, and they're cautious not to overstep boundaries. They are comfortable in a hierarchical setup. And Number 3 is task-oriented people. They are primarily from Europe, especially Northern Europe. They prefer to express their individuality while working for results within a team environment. So they are not intimidated by bosses, and they are also not very affected by pep talks, and they are not hesitant to speak their mind. So they are the task-oriented people. And then in the last group is the role-oriented people, who are mainly from Asian countries, and some of African countries as well. And I think India falls under this. And they make for disciplined employees that are good at working in teams, and they're possessing a high degree of respect to authority. They're also not comfortable with conflict. So I think if you look at the Indian corporate culture, especially people working in MNCs, it would really fit in this category.
That is absolutely amazing. Subhamoy, in India, having worked with Indian colleagues, I know that the North and the South are dramatically different. There's a big cultural difference between Northern India and Southern India. And I'm sure there are many patchwork quilts that diversify it even further. But let's talk the language of communication. The official language is Hindi. Is Hindi the most spoken language, or is it actually English? Because it seems to me English is awfully dominant in India.
Yeah, English is the language for business communication in India. And as I said that there is a divide between North and the South, cultural difference, and of course a lot of difference in language. In the South, we have around 4 to 5 different languages. In South India, there are people who don't prefer to use Hindi there, which is supposed to be the national language. And mostly people in the north understand that. In the east and the west, they understand Hindi. But what binds all those people in terms of communication, and especially business communication, is the lingua franca here, which is English. And if you look at India's prominence in English language publishing, India ranks third after the US and the UK in English language publishing in terms of books, magazines. If you talk of daily newspapers, the Times of India, that's the largest circulated English language daily newspaper, not coming from UK or US. It is in India. Across all formats of the newspaper, it is the largest circulated daily. If you look at the business dailies, out of the top 8 English dailies, 3 are from India in that list. So I can clearly say that English is the language that is most prominently used for business communication.
Then what does that do to the Indian culture? Is the natural follow-up question here.
Yeah, I think that's English has been assimilated very well by Indians, and it's a natural part of India now. So we have Indian English, and if you look at the dictionary, you'll find that UK English, US English, or Indian English. There's I think as many number of people in the US, UK, Australia combined that you'll find in India who speak English. So I think it's part of Indian culture.
I am so glad you and I finally got together. We've been talking about this for months. Thank you so much for your time today, Subhamoy.
Thanks, Doug. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and thanks for this opportunity of sharing these insights, very important stuff, which are very clearly overlooked, because you used the term while we were talking before about codifying your knowledge.
Yes.
I think this discussion has thrown some light into that part of codifying the knowledge. It's important to understand some scientific dimensions of the way we work every day.
Yeah, it's one thing to feel it, and that's important. It's another thing to consciously know it.
Right.
Yeah. If you'd like to send a message to my guest, Subhamoy.das, you can email him. It's in the show notes. It's subhamoy.das@gmail.com. He's also in New York this summer at the IABC World Conference. That is a real good one to check out. Stories and Strategies is a co-production of JGR Communications and Podcasts That Pop. We're hoping you might leave a rating for this podcast on either Apple or Spotify. Reviews are also very welcome. Be kind. You can connect with us on Twitter. It's at comms_podcast. Hey, we're also on Instagram. And more than anything else, if you like this episode, would you do us a favor and tell just one friend? And in light of this episode, tell a friend on the other side of the world. Thanks for listening.